All right, welcome back, everybody. I want to thank you all for making the trek through the snow today because we're here for what I think is the best lesson of the semester, my favorite lesson of the semester, the whole reason why I do public speaking in the first place, and that is for civic and community engagement. Now, I know some of you probably don't think of yourselves as very civic-minded, and you probably don't consider yourselves very up on current events. Maybe you don't really like politics all that much. Maybe you don't think this is really for you. The reason that we have this lesson today is because a lot of people have that mentality when they're young. And a lot of people find themselves later in life wanting to get involved either in their communities or in politics or both. Oftentimes when that happens, it happens because of something we didn't expect. Maybe somebody that you know was horribly mistreated. Maybe somebody you know died unexpectedly from something that was preventable. Maybe there's a new law that's being passed and you didn't think this law would affect you, but it's affecting you in ways that you didn't think it would. I've been telling you for the last 2 weeks or so that I've been trying really hard, and one of my big goals for you this semester is to help you all find your voices, to be able to be heard, to be able to be listened to be able to be taken seriously. And so I think the main culmination of this class is your deliberation project at the end of the semester. I think for a lot of you, it's why you take public speaking seriously. It's why you want to get better at public speaking, so you can get out there in the community and have your voices heard. I think a lot of you also find it really challenging to do this, and so I want to give you a chance to practice it, and I want to give you a chance to practice it in small groups, because I think small group communication, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks here, is also one of those very difficult skills. And so your final project for this class is going to be really difficult. It's going to ask you to do public speaking as a group, and it's going to do it in either a civic or a community or both kind of setting at the end of your class. So you're going to present to your classmates about either a civic issue or a community issue. So let's talk about this idea of civic engagement or community engagement. A few years ago, I got the luxury of teaching one of my favorite classes that I've ever taught. It's not yet on the books at the University of North Dakota, but I really hope that it is, or that it becomes that. Now, the class was brilliantly titled, I wish I could take credit for this title, by my dissertation advisor, Foundations of Civic and Community Engagement. And I really, really like this title because it highlights some of the key tensions of what activism looks like. So we're actually going to do a little experiment that I used to do on the first day of that class. Today's going to be kind of like a crash course of that entire semester put into 50 minutes. We're going to take each of those terms and we're going to see what comes to mind when you think of those terms. Now, you all are my quieter class, and so getting you to talk sometimes in a room this big is kind of like pulling teeth. So what I'd like you to do before you speak to the whole class is I want you to turn to a neighbor, pick one of the 4 nouns in the title of this class, foundation, civic, community, or engagement, and just do some word exercises of what comes to mind when you hear one of those words. You can decide which of those 4 you want to take on, but pick one of them and talk to one of your neighbors and say, what comes to mind when you hear the word civic? Or what comes to mind when you hear the word foundation? So take a second or two to do that. I'll dim the lights when I'm ready to talk, but go ahead and talk to your neighbors. Just what comes to mind with any of those terms? I should see a little bit more lips moving. I'm a little concerned that I see some not moving in the back of the room. All right, sounds like it's dying down a little bit here. So somebody tell me which term you chose. You can choose any of the 4. Tell me what you discussed with your partner. Yeah. Okay, you thought of a house for foundations. That's good. Do you have more to say on that? Good, so you have a solid foundation. Usually a foundation is kind of like the starting point. You lay a foundation for our house, it's a physical foundation. We build on top of that. If that foundation isn't solid, if that foundation isn't stable, then we have a hard time trusting anything that comes beyond that. So in the United States, when we're thinking civically and politically, we have a lot of foundational documents that we like to talk about. They're not concrete foundations like you find with the house, but a lot of times when you're teaching American history and politics, a lot of people will start with the Declaration of Independence and they'll start with the Constitution as foundations for how we understand our political system. And from there, we have state laws, we have federal laws, we have different government agencies, but that's kind of our foundation for politics, and that's what a lot of people go back to in times of crisis. So that's good. I like the metaphor of a house. Did anybody else talk about the term foundation? I won't necessarily put you on the spot, but does anybody have any other thoughts on that word? What comes to mind? All right, that's all right. Somebody tell me another term that you all talked about. Engagement. Tell me what comes to mind when you think of engagement. Involvement. Okay, so involvement, activism. Anybody else choose the term engagement? Again, I won't necessarily put you on the spot. Do we have other words that come to mind when we think about being engaged?
Interested.
What's that?
Interested.
Interested, yeah. Sometimes when I talk about engagement, I like to poke at my wedding ring and see if that sparks anything for any of you. Usually engagement signifies some kind of commitment. It usually signifies some kind of continued interest and not just something we do short term. Any other words that come to mind with engagement? All right, how about civic? What is civic? This is probably the hardest word that we had up here. Anybody have any thoughts about what civic is? Maybe you took a civics class in high school? Yeah.
Relating to like a community or town.
Okay, so often civic applies to a community or a town, usually in the context of what? What's that? Yeah, usually citizenship, usually laws and customs. When we talk about civic life, it's usually about our political life. Are there any other terms that come to mind with civics or civic? All right, how about community? What's a community? You guys are doing well. Keep up. Unity. Okay, good. So usually it's a group of people who have some things in common. Maybe they have shared interests. Maybe they have shared demographic characteristics. Maybe they're united. Maybe they're a little bit divided among themselves. But overall, we like to think of them as pretty united and pretty unified toward the same front. They have common goals. They have common ways of seeing the world. They have common things that they like to do. Any other thoughts about the word community? I know it's not the most fun exercise at 2 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, and I'll tell you there's a method behind this, and there's a reason why we're talking about it. Anybody have any other thoughts they want to say about any of these 4 terms? All right, let's see what we can do then, and see if we can figure out what civic engagement would mean. If we pair 2 of them together, what would civic engagement mean?
Political engagement.
Usually engagement in politics. Engagement, how so? Doing what? Is it just voting? A lot of people think of civic engagement and their civic duties as I vote every 2 years or every 4 years in elections. I wring my hands of it, I'm done. Yeah?
Maybe just being a citizen in the political system is what people think.
Okay, so what do you mean by that? I think that's good.
An American citizen follows American laws.
Okay, so following and obeying laws, not getting into too much trouble could be civic engagement. Anybody want to challenge that or give other things that might be part of that?
Being informed,
Being informed. Say more about that.
like just on politics, like what's going on.
Okay, so knowing what's going on in current events, reading the newspaper, maybe reading your social media feed for more than just what the Kardashians are up to. Okay. Other thoughts about what civic engagement might look like? What about community engagement? How is that different from civic engagement? What would community engagement look like?
Giving back to your community.
Okay, giving back to your community, how so?
Fundraisers.
Okay, fundraisers, charities. Are there other ways people give back to their community?
Volunteer firefighters.
Good, volunteer work, right? There's lots of different things that we do to try and change the world around us. And we have a lot of civic and political institutions, and we're forming new ones all the time. There's lots of voluntary associations that people join. So I love the title of this class that I taught for the reason that it's full of a whole bunch of tensions. And those tensions pretty much tell you almost everything you need to know about civic and community engagement, but also that civic and community engagement themselves are not necessarily easy things. So we talked about civic as mostly political engagement. I talked about voting. You have lots of different rights in the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, right? Those are all different modes of political engagement that you have as rights in the United States, and you can express those rights. We also have times when we would rather not get involved politically to change issues, but sometimes we see problems based on our neighborhoods that we live in. Maybe there's a criminal lurking around our neighborhood, and so we form a neighborhood watch system, and we don't rely on the police to just be our sole protectors, right? Maybe there's some discrimination, and communities form up because some hate crime happened, and people want to express that they're not okay with that hate crime. What happens is that the political and the social, or the civic and the community, are often at odds with one another. So you can probably think of some places where they might overlap. You can also probably think of some places where they might be separate domains. Either way, we often use speech to try and influence what's happening in politics and also what's happening in our communities. What's really interesting when you teach a class like civic and community engagement is you realize that a lot of times we have strong faith in our political institutions, and people like to think that they're working fine and they're working really well. When political institutions fail, what's really interesting is a lot of people will turn instead to social organizations to fix those kinds of problems. The same thing happens when we have government that has a hard time finding out what to do with particular communities. So we've had a long historic debate in this country over what our immigration policy could be. We have lots of community conversations about the LGBT community and what rights the LGBT community should have. We have lots of different ways of engaging, and they're not all political and they're not all social. There's a small portion where they overlap. That's actually probably not a small portion where they overlap, because there's a famous feminist mantra that says the personal is political. What might that mean? What does it mean to have your personal ideas become political, and the personal is always political? Anybody want to guess at that? Okay, we've gone quiet again. I'm going to keep pushing you on that. Go ahead.
Just your rights, I guess, in general.
Okay, so if your rights are being threatened, if your rights are being taken away, it's often the case that you will turn to politics to fix that. I'm not getting what I need out of my government, and so I'm going to turn to either political or community engagement to try and fix it. Anybody else want to say more about what it might mean for the personal to be political? We'll see if we can answer that question by the end of the day, but the short version of it is that what affects me personally often isn't just my own problem. It's a problem that affects other people around the country. Something like mental health. A lot of students struggle with depression and anxiety. If you're feeling like you have depression and anxiety, you probably can be comfortable knowing that there are lots of other people in the room who also have depression and anxiety. What sometimes seems like my own individual problem is actually a collective one. And sometimes people will form associations to try and solve problems, and often we do that, again, through speech. Now, there's another tension that I find really interesting in this title, probably even more interesting than the tension between political and social. And that is the tension between stability and change. If we think about foundations, if we think about the foundation of our house, we said the one thing that we really want it to be is strong and stable. We want it to be something we can depend upon. And so there are lots of people who really like the way that government's functioning. They're worried that other people are trying to change government to make it dysfunctional, and they want to do what they can to preserve order and to preserve stability. And they use their speech to try and fight against change. There are other people who say the system for me or for people that I care about is broken, and so I'm going to try and fix that system by trying to engage. I'm going to fix that system by trying to change it. And so what we have here is a lot of different people fighting over a lot of different things with different starting places and different endpoints of where they are and where they want to get to. And so I want you to challenge you to think about where you stand on some of these issues, and what are some things that at the end of the day you might not consider yourself a very active person. You might not think this civic and community engagement stuff is for you. what are some issues that you're really diehard concerned about, you really care about, and that on any given day, if someone challenges you, you will school them because you know that you're right and they're wrong. Or at least you're invested enough to care and to be able to speak out about those issues. Because that's what I want to push you toward for your deliberations when you work in small groups. You're going to have challenges. You're going to have people in your group who might want to solve a problem politically and another small faction that wants to solve them socially. You might have people who want to keep things the way they are and prevent them from changing. You have other people who probably want to make change happen. I'm going to help you out a little bit in that we talked about stasis theory, and I told you that your deliberations should all include a thesis statement at the stasis of policy. Some governing body should specific policy. That implies that some part of the system isn't currently working and you need to engage in order to change it. So I've given you these terms, I've given you some tensions to think about as you're thinking about community and civic engagement. What I want you to think about is how they relate to other things that we've already talked about in this class so far. We've spent a lot of the last 2 weeks covering persuasion. I've given you tools to help you with claims, evidence, and reasoning in order to make the strongest arguments you can, whether those arguments are ultimately in favor of stability or in favor of change. We talked about the communication model, and one of the big payoffs of the communication model is it gets us to think really critically about intent and effect, and how do we know whether communication is working or when it fails, and what do we do about it? Who do we blame when miscommunication happens? Do we judge our civic and community engagement based on whether it has effects and whether it actually makes gun laws change or whether it makes people behave differently? Or do we measure things by their intent? Well, this group meant well, and therefore they're doing a good job. Or maybe we have other standards by which we measure success when it comes to civic and community engagement. We talked about the rhetorical situation. You might remember that that consists of 3 main things: an exigence, an audience, and constraints. When Bitzer talked about an exigence, he defined it as an imperfection marked by urgency. That is, there's a really serious problem, and we need to solve that problem right now. One of the big challenges that I'm going to push you on later today is to think about exigence not just from the standpoint of me and always thinking about yourself from that egocentric model, but instead to think again from an audience analysis kind of perspective and think about, what does my audience have to gain from my position? What does my audience have to gain from my decision to engage? We talked a lot a few weeks ago on video for you, unfortunately, about communication ethics and how difficult it is to consider communication ethics, because oftentimes people like to frame ethics in terms of winners and losers, which isn't always the case. We want our ethics to be clear and stable and knowable, and they're not always those things. And so oftentimes engagement itself is really messy. We have lots of people arguing, they have different investments in the issue. Some of them might try to shut out other people's speech, and so we had a short conversation about what does free speech look like in a democratic society? What does responsible speech look like in a democratic society? Sometimes those things are a little bit at odds with one another, and how we define and how we understand free speech is often through the process of deliberation. Last but not least, the main reason why I want you all to get involved with this kind of concept is because I want you all to find your voices and get out there and actually have people listen to you and take you seriously if that's what you want. And you may not want it right now, but you may want it when you're 30 or 40 or 60. So I'm going to give you some examples of some people who do civic and community engagement, and we're going to talk about what it looks like, because I think a lot of people say that that's kind of reserved for later on. Before we get to that, we're going to do today's participation question just to see how well you understand the concepts of civic and community engagement. I'm not going to have you turn these in right away, but you can go ahead and take out a sheet of paper. And on that sheet of paper, you put your name, your lab instructor, your section number, and your answer to the question that I'm going to put up on the board. Again, I'm not going to have you turn these in right away. You can turn them in when you leave today. But those are the 4 things that we always put up here: your name, your lab instructor, your section number, and your answer. So the question is, I've got a couple different scenarios up here, and I want you to tell me which of these scenarios doesn't qualify as either civic or community engagement. So I'll let you read through those scenarios on your own. I'll let you form your judgment. Which one of them does not count as civic or community engagement? And when you're finished with this, once again, I'm going to have you turn to a neighbor and explain why you chose the answer that you chose. So again, your name, your lab instructor, your section number, your answer. When you've got your answer, turn to a neighbor or two and tell them why you chose the answer that you chose. Does everybody at least have an answer? Raise your hand if you still need more time. All right. Somebody brave, tell me why you chose the answer that you chose. Which answer did you choose and why? Or we can do it this way. Raise your hand if you chose A as your answer. A couple of you, tell me why.
As far as like civic and community engagement, I guess in the social media community it might be, but I don't see it like actually being in the community. I mean, I guess if you were like to post it in like the Grand Forks town hall like Facebook page or something, maybe it would involve the community. I just think it's more personal than involving civic or community.
Okay, so there's often a question over whether internet social media activism constitutes engagement. And if it does it constitute sufficient engagement? Is it the same as holding a protest, as petitioning members of Congress, as voting? Maybe, maybe not. There's a perennial question that comes up in the age of social media of whether being engaged on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere is the same as actually getting involved with the people around you and meeting face to face. Okay. Somebody tell me why you chose a different answer here. Yeah. Okay, raise your hand if you also chose D. A couple of you. Last semester that was the most popular answer here. A lot of people think that if you're just reporting facts, if you're just reporting current events, that that's not really engagement because journalists are supposed to try as much as possible to be objective. They're not supposed to take sides on political controversies. And maybe they're just reporting information, they're just spreading that information. Now I'll tell you that I consider this still, D, to be civic and community engagement. And the reason for that is there's a communication theory called agenda setting theory. And agenda setting theory was a popular theory that came out, it was kind of political science motivated. And it basically says that the media tell us not what to think, but they do tell us what to think about. That is, they help shape conversations. They tell us what conversations are interesting and important, and they help us think about issues. Even if they're trying to be objective, they're not always objective. In fact, there's a really good project that you can find called Red Feed, Blue Feed. I think it's through the Washington Post, that actually shows the same issues and how media companies that lean left and media companies that lean right report the same issues. How they frame those issues then shape how people think about those issues. It's not necessarily telling them what to think, but it is telling them what to think about, and often with a little bit of a partisan spin, even if it's trying not to do that. Okay, somebody give me another answer here. Raise your hand if you chose E. Tell me why you chose E. Somebody. Just a couple of you. I'm guessing that some of you chose E because you don't really like what those people were marching about. You don't really like their message. They're not part of the mainstream political culture. They're not part of the mainstream communal culture that a lot of us buy into. And so you might have rejected E on the premise that I don't like their message, and most rational people also don't like their message and reject what they stand for. I'd tell you that this is still civic and community engagement. It doesn't necessarily have to be good civic and community engagement, but it's civic and community engagement because they are trying to get their voices heard. They feel like they haven't been heard. And so we have to figure out what to do with their civic and community engagement. We have to figure out how we handle other people's civic and community engagement that we don't like. It's not an easy thing to do. Somebody else tell me why you might have chosen B or C. Yeah.
Like none of the above answer.
It could be. Is that what you decide to write on yours?
Yeah, if they're all technically some form of like civic or engagement.
Okay, let's come back to that. Put a pin in that for a second. It's an interesting thought. Anybody else want to tell me why you might have chosen B or C as an option? I know you guys are quiet. I'm going to try and push you. Most of you don't know each other's names in here, so there's really not a whole lot of pressure of being judged.
We chose B.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily addressing like an issue in the community.
Okay. So he chose B because he said it's not really an issue in the community. It's not really addressing some kind of problem, thinking probably in terms of Bitzer and that exigence, that imperfection marked by urgency. It's not really solving a problem, so does it constitute community engagement? I would argue that B still on some level does, especially in a community like Grand Forks that is about 97% white. There are a lot of people who are not from Norwegian, Scandinavian backgrounds, didn't grow up in North Dakota, and holding a film festival or a cultural event or a dinner can be a way of introducing other people to other communities that they might not have an interest in. Okay? Anybody want to try with C here? If you guessed C, a lot of you probably also were in that realm of that civic or community engagement that I don't really like. Or you say maybe they're just celebrities, or they're not really actually making much of a difference, they're just kind of trying to make a name for themselves. Not endorsing that position, I'm just trying to rationalize why some of you might have chosen that one. When I crafted this, I had in mind that there is a F, none of the above answer. Things that we don't traditionally think of as civic or community engagement are often civic or both and community engagement. A lot of times, people are trying to have their voices heard, even in ways that we don't necessarily expect, and we have to figure out what to do with that. Part of why I love rhetoric and speech is because it helps us figure out who we are as people and how we relate to other people who are different from us. And so you might not necessarily think of what you're doing in a civic context or a community context, but a lot of you are actually doing different engagement activities on a daily basis. So we've talked about that. Now, when we talk about civic and community engagement, let's focus on civic engagement. Who do you usually think of as the people who make political change happen? Who's the first person or group comes to mind in terms of making political change happen? Raise your hand. Yeah. The Oval Office? Is that what you said?
Federal office.
Oh, federal office? Okay. Who else do you think of as making political change happen? The House and the Senate, right? Usually when we talk about political change, we think about our elected officials. We might think specifically about the legislative branch of the US government. For a lot of people, the image that probably comes to mind when I ask you about civic engagement is the US presidency. We talk about our presidents as the leader of the free world. We talk about them as the most powerful person in the world. So for a lot of you, this is what political engagement looks like, and it's reserved for those elected officials who are quite a bit older, quite a bit more experienced, quite a bit more passionate than we are at making political change happen. For a lot of you, that's probably what you had in mind, and you can imagine that with the exception of Barack Obama, the US presidency has looked pretty much the same. It's been an old white male. That's not to say that it's a value judgment of whether that's good or bad. It's just to point out that if that's your model of civic and community engagement, then think about the voices that may not be included in the civic or political process. I'm not trying to get too political here, but I am trying to say that if you reserve political engagement for politicians, whether the president or members of the House and the Senate, then you're basically shirking off some of your civic duty. Somebody tell me what the first 3 words to the US Constitution are. We the people. Good. We the people have a lot of civic duties, and they extend beyond voting. So what we're going to talk about for a lot of today are people who you wouldn't necessarily expect as people who have had their voices heard and who have made change. I'm curious if any of you recognize this woman on the board or have heard of Doris Haddock or Granny D before. I'm guessing not many of you, if any of you. Anybody heard of Granny D? Granny D is one of those people that I look up to and say, I want to be her when I grow up. And not necessarily because I agree with the cause that she happened to champion, but because of her life story and what she did with her passion for that cause. Granny D was a woman who was really active. She was kind of like a hippie in the 60s, really active in a lot of political movements. She got married, had kids, still did a little bit of politics, but once she got married and had kids, became a little bit more conservative, not in the political sense, just in the less activism kind of sense. And Granny D had a problem. She actually had a couple problems that happened around the same time. Her husband had passed away, and one of her best friends passed away. And what happened is Granny D decided, I'm 89 years old, I'm turning 90 soon. I don't have that much time left on this earth, and there's something that's really been bothering me, and I want to do something about it. So this 89-year-old woman decides she is fed up with campaign finance laws in the United States. She's fed up with all the money that's in our elections. She's fed up with politicians taking money from corporations or from big donors, getting elected to office, not delivering their promises, and as a result, giving back to the people who got them elected kind of as a quid pro quo. This for that. You got me elected, so I'm going to do you a favor, and I'm not going to pass these legislation, or I'm going to pass this legislation if it helps your company. Granny D is really fed up with campaign finance laws. She says there's too much money in politics, and pretty much all of our politicians are corrupt in some way or another. So she decides to do something about it. What does she decide to do? At 90 years old, Doris Haddock decides she's going to go on a walking campaign. She's going to walk across the continental United States to educate people about campaign finance laws and to try to push campaign finance reform. So at 90 years old, she walks from pretty much anywhere you can think of except for Alaska or Hawaii. She walks through the Dakotas. She walks through Texas, through California, through Washington, through DC. She spends almost a year of her life walking around the United States, meeting as many people as she can, trying to get energy for her cause. She walks around the continental United States and ends her tour in Washington, D.C., where she gives a speech at the Capitol Rotunda. Does anybody want to guess what happens as a result of Granny D giving that speech? How many of you think campaign finance laws magically came into existence and a bunch of people clapped and cheered and celebrated her? Maybe? Try and guess. There's no right or, well, there is a right or wrong, but I don't expect you to know it. What do you think happened when she gives her big speech at the end of her walking tour?
Did no one show up?
What?
Did no one show up?
Nobody showed up? No, there were people there. At the end of her walking tour, this 90-year-old woman got arrested in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Why did she get arrested? Because it's illegal to protest. It's illegal to give speeches in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda about political issues. She knew that she was going to get arrested. She got arrested for her cause at 90 years old. She didn't stay arrested very long, but she continued for the next 10 years or so pushing campaign finance reform. In 2004, there was a bill passed in Congress, a bipartisan bill called the McCain-Feingold Act. The McCain-Feingold Act tried to get some of the money out of politics, and John McCain and Russ Feingold credited Granny D in part for pushing momentum behind that act. In 2010, we saw a partial repeal of that act through a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. Citizens United overturned some of the McCain-Feingold Act and allowed for a little bit more money to go back into politics. The same year that Citizens United was decided, Granny D passed away. She was about 100 years old. 2010, Granny D passed away. So you might not think that you have much of a voice as a 22-year-old or an 18-year-old. I can tell you that sometimes life takes us in unexpected places, and if Granny D at 90 years old can walk across the continental United States, there are causes that you all can get involved in too. So she's one person who I say I want to be like when I grow up. There's another person who I say that about often, somebody I used to teach when I taught my civic and community engagement class. Anybody recognize who this is? Yeah, who is it? Malala Yousafzai. And who's Malala Yousafzai? Good. She was, at the time, I think, 16-year-old Pakistani woman who was going to school in a region that the Taliban had taken over in the war on Iraq and Afghanistan. Basically, the Taliban came in and said, we don't like that you're sending your Pakistani girls to school. Her father helped run the school that she went to. She ran a BBC diary, a BBC blog of her experiences of life under Taliban rule. Where she grew up, it wasn't always Taliban controlled, but it became that way after the US got involved in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So she goes to school, she writes this blog very critical of the Pakistani Taliban. On her way to school, Malala Yousafzai gets shot. And this Talib who shot her thinks that she's going to die and thinks that he's going to be a hero. So Malala lives through this ordeal, and on her 16th birthday, she must have been younger than that, I think she was 14 or 15. On her 16th birthday, she gives a speech at the UN. The United Nations decides that they're going to have what they call Malala Day. It's going to be a day for women's education around the world, and they start a Malala Fund to help raise money to educate more girls in places like where Malala grew up, where she can no longer go to school safely. So I'm going to play a couple clips from that speech. It's like a 20-minute long speech. I don't have time to show you the whole thing. But just to get you thinking about another person who's the same age as you are. She's now at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. Same age as you are, making her voice heard.
Dear friends, on the 9th of October 2012, the Taliban shot me on the left side of my forehead. They shot my friends too. They thought that the bullet would silence us, but they failed. And out of that silence came thousands of voices. The terrorists thought that they would change my aims and stop my ambitions. But nothing changed in my life except this. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage was born. I am the same Malala. My ambitions are the same. My hopes are the same. And my dreams are the same. I'm here to speak up for the right of education of every child. One teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. Education is the only solution. Education first. Thank you.
So obviously I can't show you the whole clip here. I wish we had time to watch it because it's a very inspiring, very powerful speech. I think on some level when Malala started writing for the BBC and was very critical of people who like their weapons and like to make their voice heard through their weapons, that her life might have been in danger. I don't know that she thought she would become an activist and would end up speaking for the rest of her life about getting shot in the head and surviving. So there's a lot of people who are very excited about what Malala is doing. There are some people who are a little skeptical of what she's doing. My point in showing you her speech is so that you can see that somebody your age is making a difference in the world. Show you a couple more examples of that. This is another example from a couple of years ago. There was a young man in Iowa who decided that when he was in college at the University of Iowa, there was a lot of talk about people who were trying to preserve what they saw as an institution, a foundational institution that they wanted to keep. That foundation was marriage between a man and a woman. There were laws before the Senate in Iowa trying to define marriage as between one man and one woman. And I'm not here to tell you what you have to think about same-sex marriage. I'm not here to tell you what to think about any issue. What I'm here to do is to help you figure out how to think and to see some examples of how people speak out when the laws change around them and they don't know what to do about it. One of the ways that you can fight oppressive powers, if you see them that way, is through speech. So we're going to watch an example from Zach Walls. Zach Walls is about your age when he gave this speech, and he was trying to stop this new law from being passed.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. My name is Zach Walls. I'm a sixth-generation Iowan and an student at the University of Iowa, and I was raised by two women. My biological mom, Terry, told her grandparents that she was pregnant and that the artificial insemination had worked and they wouldn't even acknowledge it. It actually wasn't until I was born and they succumbed to my infantile cuteness that they broke down and told her that they were thrilled to have another grandson. Unfortunately, neither of them lived to see her marry her partner Jackie for 15 years when they wed in 2009. My younger sister and only sibling was born in 1994. We actually have the same anonymous donor, so we're full siblings, which is really cool for me. And I guess the point is that our family really isn't so different from any other Iowa family. When I'm home, we go to church together, we eat dinner, we go on vacations. But we have our hard times too, we get in fights. Actually, my mom, Terry, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2000. It was a devastating disease that put her in a wheelchair, so we've had our struggles. But, we're Iowans. We don't expect anyone to solve our problems for us. We'll fight our own battles. We just hope for equal and fair treatment from our government. Being a student at the University of Iowa, the topic of same-sex marriage comes up quite frequently in classroom discussions. The question always comes down to, well, can gays even raise kids? And the conversation gets quiet for a moment, because most people don't really have an answer. And then I raise my hand and say, actually, I was raised by a gay couple, and I'm doing pretty well. I scored in the 99th percentile on the ACT. I'm actually an Eagle Scout. I own and operate my own small business. If I was your son, Mr. Chairman, I believe I'd make you very proud. I'm not really so different from any of your children. My family really isn't so different from yours. After all, your family doesn't derive its sense of worth from being told by the state, you're married, congratulations. No, the sense of family comes from the commitment we make to each other, to work through the hard times so we can enjoy the good ones. It comes from the love that binds us. That's what makes a family. So what you're voting here isn't to change us. It's not to change our families, it's to change how the law views us, how the law treats us. You are voting for the first time in the history of our state to codify discrimination into our Constitution. A Constitution that, but for the proposed amendment, is the least amended Constitution in the United States of America. You are telling Iowans that some among you are second-class citizens who do not have the right to marry the person you love. So will this vote affect my family? Will it affect yours? Over the next 2 hours, I'm sure we're going to hear plenty of testimony about how damaging having gay parents is on kids. But in my 19 years, not once have I ever been confronted by an individual who realized independently that I was raised by a gay couple. And you know why? Because the sexual orientation of my parents has had zero effect on the content of my parenting. Thank you very much.
So again, I'm not here to tell you that you have to agree or disagree with Zach Walls. One thing that I do find interesting is there's been some time since this speech was given, and Zach Walls, from what I understand, is now running for office in Iowa. And so that's something to keep in mind and pay attention to if you're interested in that. I'll give you one other example here, and this is an example from my former student, Elijah, who gave me permission to share this with all of you. We're not going to watch his TED Talk, but I'll tell you Elijah's story, because I think it's a really good example of how you translate a personal exigence into a public one that other people will care about. Elijah went to school in Florida, and Elijah has severe epilepsy. And his school, he says, was built in the 1860s, had really old fluorescent lighting, and it was on a block schedule, so he went to math class 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And because of the fluorescent lighting, he would have a seizure every day in his math class. Every day. His school decided there's not really anything we can do to help you. It's not really in our budget. It's not really anything that we can do. They tried to make Elijah and his epilepsy go away. I'll tell you what Elijah did. Elijah stood up to his school. He actually sued his school and won. Elijah has met with two former secretaries of education, several elected officials, and has a blog that he calls Equal Opportunities for Students. You can see it on YouTube. Elijah's taken his personal cause and is recognizing that his school was in direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So he fights for that act. He fights for Title IX. He fights for better access for students to go to school, for people who can't always do that. And one of the biggest challenges I had when Elijah was my student is I said, you have a really clear, strong personal exigence. I can see how much your epilepsy and the treatment that you've gotten because of your epilepsy has affected you. But I really want you to find a way to channel that energy and to try and figure out how to do something with it. And he's actually doing a lot with it. So I tell you all of these stories with hope that it'll inspire you. I don't necessarily expect you to be Malala or Granny D. I also share these stories with you because, again, a lot of times people don't expect to get engaged civically or politically until they have to. And then once you have to, you don't really have a choice. So I want to wrap up today by just talking to you about how persuasion operates in this context. We spent the last 2 weeks talking about persuasion and what you can do with persuasion. You saw Zach Walls use a whole bunch of ethos, pathos, and logos to try and get you on his side. It may or may not have worked. But as long as people have been studying speech, people have been studying the relationship between persuasion and coercion. Back when we were talking with Plato and Aristotle, there were lots of people who were very concerned that speech was kind of manipulative and that they wanted to separate out speech because they saw it as our best available alternative to violence. We don't want to have wars. When we have wars, a lot of people die, a lot of people get injured. We don't want to see that. Speech might be one of our best alternatives to violence. That's how I started studying what I study when I'm not teaching you all. Then in the 20th century, there were a lot of people who didn't really like the term persuasion. They thought maybe we don't want to talk in terms of persuasion because we don't necessarily know people's intent or effect. So we're going to talk about influence. And influence might be intentional. Influence might have an effect on people, but it's not necessarily clear that it has to. What are some results of watching television? What are some results of seeing advertisements? What are some results of hearing political messages? Sometimes people are influenced in ways that we don't expect them to be. We then have Kenneth Burke, who comes around in the 20th century. Kenneth Burke is one of the leading rhetoricians of the 21st century. He's basically to rhetoric what Freud was to psychology. And he says maybe it's not necessarily about persuasion. Maybe we're not always trying to get people to agree with us. But Burke takes more of a community perspective on it. And he says that people have things that make us unique and things that make us like other people. So we have our own individual selves. We also have collectives of groups that we like to join. So he talks about it in terms of identification and says every time that we find groups of other people that we call a we, we're excluding other people who are a they, us versus them. And he's trying to use rhetoric and speech to try and understand how we make community happen, often through speech and engagement. Last but not least, we have at the end of the 20th century this idea that this whole focus on persuasion for the last 2,500 years is misguided. And when we talk about persuasion, it's inherently violent. It's inherently violent because it comes with an agenda. I try to persuade you, and by me trying to impose my beliefs onto you, you don't really have a whole lot of choice other than to accept or reject my message. Instead, what the two feminist theorists, Foss and Griffin, call invitational rhetoric is a chance to get everyone at the table. When we have speech, when we have deliberation, when we communicate with one another, we're not trying to persuade, we're not trying to manipulate people. We're trying to make sure that everybody's voice gets heard, and if change happens, great, and if change doesn't happen, that's fine. So this is a brief history of persuasion and civic and community engagement in the 20th century. And that leads to what you read for today. What you read for today was Dana Cloud and Lena Lozano, who were talking about this idea of invitational rhetoric as kind of the opposite of persuasion. We could see a continuum from invitational rhetoric through identification, influence, persuasion, coercion, all the way to force. If nobody has a gun to my head, then we're probably in the realm of rhetoric, we're probably in the realm of speech, but even coercion's pretty uncomfortable for a lot of people. At the same time, Lozano, Reich, and Cloud are really concerned that invitational rhetoric is too much in the civil tradition. What invitational rhetoric says is put your identities aside, put your agendas aside, put everything out on the table, and just have a conversation and get to know each other, and by the end of the day, we'll all be friends. And I bring this to your attention because we talk a lot about civility in Minnesota and North Dakota. You've probably seen these billboards around here that say, be nice, or be polite, or bullying hurts. These are giant campaigns, and they're designed to say that we have this concept of Minnesota and North Dakota nice. A lot of outsiders to Minnesota and North Dakota say it's not Minnesota nice, or North Dakota nice, it's passive-aggressive. We're not supposed to talk about politics. We're not supposed to talk about sex, or race, or anything controversial. Instead, why can't we all just get along? If we just shy away from those subjects and pretend like everything's going fine, then we'll be just fine. Now, I'll tell you that Dana Cloud hates this idea. Dana Cloud is a radical feminist lesbian. She fights very hard to try and get more people's voices included. She's had her voice threatened so many times that a person actually threatened to have the state sued to take away her kids. When I first met Dana Cloud, she was talking at a conference, and this was behind her the whole time. I share this with you because I think there's a culture that says you're not supposed to have a voice. You're not supposed to talk about controversy. If you do, you're rude. You're an outsider. And I'm trying not to be too stereotypical because, like I said, I am from Minnesota. I get this culture. What I'm trying to challenge you on today is recognizing how that culture of Minnesota, North Dakota nice can sometimes shut down civic and community engagement, and it makes it seem like we all get along even though we don't. And so I'm going to leave you with a quotation from a man who was very resistant to the Nazis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was very outspoken. He was very concerned about what the Nazis were doing in Europe. And one of his things that he said before he was killed by the Nazis was, "Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act." And so I'm hoping that through some of the examples you've seen today that you can think through some of the issues that are exciting to you, and you can figure out what you want to do with them. How are you going to have your voice heard? Because if you choose to stay silent, you have nothing but your silence when somebody comes for your rights, or somebody comes from somebody you care about. So I'll leave you with that thought today, and I'll see you all next week.